Hello everyone, welcome to our first Refugee Solidarity Week event from Human Rights Solidarity. My name is Asiya, I'm a student and volunteer in Human Rights Solidarity, and I'll be your host today. So, what is Human Rights Solidarity, and who are we? Human Rights Solidarity is made up of young volunteer refugees from all over the UK, and we're trying our best to make this week an opportunity of activism. We're a very new organisation. We hope to grow through your support and help. Our first event was a participation in a women's rights event. We participated in the Million Women Rights Walk on 7th of March in central London. We defended women's rights, marching alongside thousands of women activists with a prison cell, which represented the thousands of women and babies kept as prisoners in Turkey. We wanted to contribute to the global advocacy of human rights, which supports some of the most vulnerable in our society. During Refugee Week, we wanted to draw attention to those human rights abuses experienced by refugees, giving them a platform to voice their concerns as well as their hopes and ambitions of their own future. So, what's on this week? You will watch performances from refugees, interviews with well-established refugees to inspire recent refugees to the UK. Some of these will be live. In today's session, we're hosting the founder of Refugees at Home, the lovely Sara Nathan, the founder of RefuNet, Bethany Holden, as well as some art performances from our lovely volunteers. Enjoy!
Hello everyone and welcome to our talk today with Sara Nathan, the co-founder of Refugees at Home. I would love to describe her more and introduce her, but I'll leave that to you, Sara.
Okay, well, we started Refugees at Home almost 5 years ago now, in late 2015, started taking people in early 2016 and have been going ever since. We started basically around a kitchen table. We've got a bit bigger now, but of course the lockdown and the pandemic means that we've had to shrink a bit. So it's been quite a complicated time recently. But before that, I worked in the public sector quite a lot. I'm a journalist and a former editor of programmes on BBC and Channel 4.
Great. And what was your inspiration to start off this project?
Well, we really started Refugees at Home because my brother and his wife, and indeed us, were all kind of empty nesters. Our children had grown up. And Nina, my sister-in-law, her mum had been a refugee from Vienna from the Nazis in the 30s. And at the same time, Timothy and my grandparents had taken in a kinder transport boy, and the other grandparents had taken in a cafe violinist, also from Vienna, and his wife. So we know that a response to a problem or crisis or the needs of refugees could be hosting them in your own homes. Timothy and Nina just wanted to host, but we couldn't find anybody at the time who was doing much organising of it, and certainly not in a kind of contemporary way. So we thought, well, if nobody's really organising this for where we live, somebody better had, and that somebody's going to be us. So we started researching, looking at it, and as I said, rolled out 2015, 2016.
Wow, that is a great history of refugees. On your About page for the Refugees at Home website, it mentioned that you hosted some of your guests from around 1 day to 9 months. 9 months is a very long time. I mean, how did you cope with it? What struggles did you face? What benefits did it also have to the household? Could you just explain what that was like?
Actually, for me, I have gone from 1 day, but because of the lockdown, my longest guest is now the current chap who's been with us for pretty much a year, because he hasn't been able to move on. He thought he was going to, and then he couldn't, and then there was Ramadan, and now we're thinking again. And actually, it's hugely varied. Some people only need a little time, or they come to us because they have somewhere else lined up. People who stay longer, often it's 3 to 6 months. That's the usual thing. It takes a little while to settle down together and to get used to each other's foibles. I mean, we can't bear anybody smoking in the house, for instance, but I don't mind what people do on the patio. We're quite easygoing. And we have some pretty basic house rules about not drinking the last of the milk or eating the last banana, which is immensely more important than things you'd think would be really difficult, but they're not. It's the day-to-day. It's like having flatmates. You know, you've got to know what each other are going to do. Helps if you can communicate, but and in fact, about 2 days ago, we bumped into our very first guest, who stayed with us towards the end of 2016 for 9 months. He was our previously longest standing. He's still living in our area, and he's working for Deliveroo. And he was on his bike on his way to a local restaurant to pick up breakfast for somebody, and hailed us in the street. It was lovely to see him. I mean, we're on good terms with well, all the guests we've got to know well. You know, we're not in touch with everybody because if people come for a few days, they probably aren't going to stay in touch. But we still hear we're okay in lockdown. So that's fine too. So we've had relatively few problems, and it's been lovely. I mean, the big advantage of hosting during lockdown is you don't murder your partner, because 2 people in a house all the time is not so great. 3 is maybe better. There are times when actually having a guest is really positive. And of course, then there's the cooking.
Yeah.
I don't do all of it. Moha does lots of it. It's fantastic. We've also hosted one person who was a professional chef. But you know, anything is better than doing it all yourself. So we share, and that works well. Our first barbecue with a guest tonight. So that would be.
That really is great. Now that makes me want to host a refugee myself.
Excellent. Do you have a spare room?
We don't, but we can always arrange one.
Excellent. That would be best. Just apply on www.refugeesathome.org. It says apply to host. It's very straightforward, and we don't ask very much about you. In fact, we've just discovered we ask too little, because you know, we now think we shouldn't be placing with people who are elderly or maybe who have health problems, but we've never asked the age of our hosts, let alone their we don't ask their marital status or their occupation or their income or their religion or their race. We don't ask any of that stuff because we don't think it's relevant. Start asking a few more questions, but it's not difficult.
Definitely. Now, obviously, refugees have faced many struggles, especially in terms of their homeland. So how would you describe that word, homeland?
Well, I think, is it homeland or is it home? I mean, I always think of both as the place where if you have to go there, they have to take you in. And that's really what your home is. I wouldn't define it any more romantically than that. It's the place you feel to be your home. But of course, if you're rejected by it, it may not feel like home to you at all, or a homeland.
Definitely. And again, how would you describe the word refugee?
I think a refugee is somebody who is forced to flee and has the energy and enterprise to do so. So it can be fleeing many things. It's not the same as moving because you want some better life chances, although that is also a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's having to leave because of politics or war or oppression or your sexuality or whatever it is. You have to leave. But lots of people who are in that state don't leave because they don't have the confidence, the enterprise, the way of getting out. So it's 2 halves. It's having to go and then having the will or the capacity or the ability to go.
Definitely. Obviously, a way to help a refugee would be to host them in your house. But during quarantine, in a troubling time like this, how else could we help refugees? What could we do?
Well, there are lots of ways of helping refugees. I mean, hosting is still going on during quarantine. We started quarantine with about 120 people hosted. We're down to about 85. But you know, that's 85 families all over the United Kingdom who still have somebody staying with them. And we're hoping to by the time anybody sees this, to be back hosting new people as well. The other things you can do are contribute to the drop-ins. A lot of refugees are having, or especially asylum seekers actually, even more so, because they have no income and their income hasn't gone up and the expenses are much worse now than they were before lock-in. So that would be really helpful. There are quite a lot of volunteer groups. There's also teaching English, befriending. If you've got an old bike that you don't need, you could give it to the bike project for refugees. There's Host Nation does great things. You could sign up to take courses in cooking with my great lots of fantastic things. At the very least, you could donate to somebody, you could buy a Choose Love t-shirt.
Great. Sarah, the voice sometimes comes and goes. I don't know if the mic is being affected there. The sound isn't coming at the moment. We can't hear. Still nothing. No, sorry. Hello?
Yes, okay. So I can hear you. You can't hear me at all.
I can hear you now. If it stays
Right.
this way.
Hang on, let me just sneeze. Okay, that's better, is it?
Yeah, this is better.
Okay, is that coming through regular enough?
This is coming like this now, but sometimes it can come and go. I'll inform you when it goes.
Okay, all right. Do I need to do any of the last answer again?
Yeah, we can go and do that part again. So I can ask you the question again.
So this was the question about
How can we help?
how can you help? Yeah, okay.
I'll ask you the question again now.
Please.
Okay. And Sarah, how can we help people during quarantine, apart from obviously hosting them in our house?
Well, of course, you can still host right in your house. We're still hosting about 85 people up and down the country. That's only really available if you've got a spare room and you live in a city, because none of our guests ever want to live in the countryside. But so those people can still host, and we'd love them to apply at www.refugeesathome.org. It's very easy, and we don't ask anything intrusive. There's lots else you can do. I mean, of course, everybody helping refugees, and particularly asylum seekers, needs donations. You can do the simple thing, buy a t-shirt from Choose Love. If you've got an old bike, you could donate it to the bike project. You could take classes in cookery from My Grateful, all taught by refugees. There are still some drop-ins operating. You can teach English online. You can befriend through Host Nation. There are a really serious number of small charities doing lots and lots of things all over the country, and at the moment largely virtually, to help refugees and asylum seekers across the UK and of course abroad.
Definitely. Now, through Refugees at Home, of course you've faced and met many refugees. What is a problem you've witnessed on many occasions?
I suppose the two big problems facing refugees and asylum seekers in this country, the first one is if you're an asylum seeker, you're completely without any form of agency. You can't decide what you're doing. Your life is on hold. You're at the behest of the Home Office. They make decisions very slowly and rather erratically. And that sort of treatment preys on people's minds. Asylum seekers are largely quite troubled because they can't control what's happening in their lives. They've got no money. They're not allowed to work. It's very difficult being destitute and not knowing what's happening to you for months, if not years, and occasionally decades on end. That's hugely problematic. For refugees, the big problem is, I think, that once you get refugee status, once we acknowledge that you have a well-founded fear of persecution, the definition of a refugee, you then have 28 days before you're evicted from Home Office accommodation. You've got to find somewhere to live, but you may not have a job, a bank account, much English, any access to benefits until you get universal credit, and that's weeks later, and later still if you have no bank account. So it's that getting over the hump, adjusting to your life as a refugee, where yes, you can now make decisions, but you're so economically deprived and often so isolated that making those decisions and getting on with your life is exhausting and troubling and takes a lot of time and a lot of access. It's difficult for people who don't know how Britain works, who weren't brought up here, who don't speak the language brilliantly, to access the things that are theirs as a right or that they need. And a lot of people need a lot of help with that.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. In what ways do you think refugees can benefit the country? Obviously, when someone hears the word refugee, it does often cause quite negative thoughts, but how can we make them benefit the country? In what ways do they help us?
Refugees help the UK in all sorts of ways. In fact, at Refugees at Home, we ran a small project showing pictures of our former guests who were stepping up during the pandemic. We've hosted doctors. They're now at work in full PPE, saving people's lives. But not just doctors, hospital porters. We've hosted 2 or 3 of those. Scientists, academics. And that, those are at a mixed range, and that's just with the NHS. But lots and lots of refugees offer back, as soon as they're allowed to work, as much as they can. But even before that, they offer sometimes a form of integration. I mean, our hosting is amazing because what we have is people hosting those from other backgrounds. Our guests have been very largely Muslim and a few Christians and a few nothing at all. We're Jewish and practicing, and it works perfectly well. Hosting is a model for integration, and refugees can be too. And I don't think one should think about people only being good refugees, if you like, if they contribute specifically. Almost everybody who comes to this country wants to get on, wants to study, wants to work, wants to make a difference. We stop them doing so during the asylum seeking process by forbidding people from work. And in my view, that's one of the really daft things we do. We spend my money, taxpayers' money, on making people paupers and then having to subsidize the fact that they can't work. I really resent that. It seems to me outrageous. And I don't think it depends on the level of what you're going to do. I've hosted people who are doing a PhD in pharmacology, could be incredibly useful. And I've hosted people who are working on building sites and delivering for Deliveroo, also useful. Why should one judge refugees any differently? People are making a contribution to this country. They're trying to get on. They are the most enterprising and the most determined of their country folk. They have to have got to Great Britain in the first place. This is not an easy place for a refugee to reach. And those who do are really very special and have masses to give.
Definitely. And finally, what advice would you give to a newly arrived refugee?
Well, the advice I'd give to somebody who came to the UK and intended to claim asylum was do it quickly. As soon as you get here, claim asylum and deserve refugee status. You're much more likely to get it that way. And tell the truth and be responsive, and then integrate as much as you can. Learn as much English as you can, as quickly as you can. Try not to talk Arabic or Farsi or Tigrinya or Amharic or whatever it is until you can really communicate in English, because that is possibly the most important thing you can do. Keep up your networks, but meet people outside your networks. Talk to people who are British. British people can be very fair, and they can be very accommodating, and they can be very welcoming, but you have to meet them and get to know them. Go and volunteer somewhere. Meet people who are not from your little group. Get out there, speak English, learn English, and in time you'll settle in here.
Great. That's all the questions I have for you, Sara. Is there anything else you would like to add on for our viewers?
Well, I would just like to say that I hope this project is a huge success. I hope Refugee Week is a huge success. It's going to be different from anything any of us ever done before, but then everything about the current situation is different from anything most of us have done before. I mean, what I found extraordinary really about lockdown is I'm communicating with my family and friends in the way that my refugee and asylum seeker guests have had to communicate with their family for years, and I've learned a lot. It is possible to maintain relationships at a distance, even if you don't really want to. And I'm hoping that this series and everything that's going on in Refugee Week will encourage people to communicate and connect as we'd like to in real life, but are having to do virtually.
Thank you. Thank you again, Sara, and thank you to our viewers as well for joining us here today. Please don't forget to follow Human Rights Solidarity's YouTube channel, Instagram and Twitter accounts. That's all we have for today. Thank you again, Sara. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks to Sara Nathan for her informative talk and for showing us we can all host a refugee home. Now we have an art performance from our lovely volunteers. Enjoy. thanks to our volunteers for this lovely performance. Now we have the founder of RefuNet, Bethany Holden. Enjoy.
Hello everyone and welcome to our talk today. We have Bethany with us, the founder of RefuNet. I would love to describe her more and introduce her, but I will leave that for you, Bethany.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. My name is Bethany. I'm 23. I normally live in London, but at the moment I'm living with my family in a town northwest of London during lockdown, and I founded RefuNet nearly 2 years ago now.
Thank you. And what is RefuNet? Why did you start off such an amazing project?
So basically, RefuNet finds online volunteer teachers for refugees and asylum seekers. So partly it's English lessons both for adults and kids in school. And then also there are some teachers who provide maths and science lessons to school kids who are struggling to keep up, particularly people who've only recently arrived to the UK and the school system is quite new to them. And then there's also the odd sort of random lessons. So one student is taking accounting lessons and someone else is having lessons in IT and things like that. In terms of why I set it up, I think partly it's just sort of the importance of education, and it feels like something that refugees have often been missing out on. So I was helping out with conversation classes while I was at Durham University. And it was really eye-opening for me to see how much not being able to speak English could hold people back. Partly just for work, like especially at the moment, there is so many qualified doctors who aren't able to work just because they haven't passed their English exam, which is really frustrating, but also just so important for everyday life, for, reading housing contracts, opening a bank account, going to the doctors. And I think even more importantly, just to be able to integrate into society. I can't imagine how scary it must be arriving in a country where you can't speak the language and you might not know that many people. And so being able to communicate is obviously really, really important for sort of building a new life and making a new home. And then also the sort of maths and science side, I think it's mad when you hear about people arriving in the UK and then being thrown into taking their GCSEs and A-levels, and they're probably, perfectly capable of taking them in normal situations, but they might have had their education disrupted, and they're having to adapt to a completely new system. And it doesn't seem fair that they don't have a chance to sort of settle in, adapt. They're suddenly taking exams that affect their chances of what's going to happen to them in the rest of their life, what their job opportunities are. And also kids who have a bit more time to adapt, but at the same time, if you don't understand the teacher, you obviously miss out on sort of maths and science and so much of the sort of foundations of education when you're younger that are really important when you're older. And especially classes are full anyway. For a teacher trying to cater to a student that hardly speaks English is obviously really, really difficult. So it feels like they really do need some extra support. But then so there are lots of charities that do provide the support, and I think they're really amazing. And I think often lessons in person are great because it is easier to form a personal connection that way, to make a friend that you can see more on a regular basis. But I think there are also lots of people that would like to help but aren't able to because it's harder having, for example, to commit to going to a conversation class at a certain time every week when maybe they also have a full-time job, or they live in a more remote area and they're not able to go to a place where charities are holding classes. So I think there are lots of people that really would like to help, but I couldn't find any other organisation that was allowing them to do it online. And I also think that there are students who would benefit from being able to have lessons online because they can't, maybe if they live in more remote areas, it's hard for them to travel, they're stuck at home for whatever reason. So basically, I just wanted to find a way to match these people who wanted to help but didn't really know how, and with people who were being cut off from support, really. And that was the idea behind it.
That is great. Very, very thoughtful of you. Do you have any emotional, amazing, or funny moments at RefuNet, whether it be with the refugees or whether it be with your colleagues?
Mhm. I think my favourite moment was recently so I'd had a student sign up from Turkey, and I just got in touch with him for the first time to find out a bit more about him so I could start looking for a teacher with him. And he was so grateful, even just to hear from me. I hadn't found him a teacher yet. And he said that his level of English obviously wasn't fluent, that's why he was asking for an English teacher, but he speaks sort of upper intermediate English. And he said, if there's anyone who's beginner English, I'd be really happy to help them, sort of giving back. And that day I'd had a Syrian student sign up who'd recently moved to Turkey and was looking for a Turkish teacher. And so earlier that day she'd asked me if I could find a Turkish teacher for her. And I thought, I'm not really sure how to do that. I don't have any Turkish teachers signed up. And then I had this student who was from Turkey who'd offered to help. And it was so nice that I was able to connect them. And I think to be able to, for people who sort of receiving help from someone else, to also be able to give back is like really nice sort of full circle. Yeah. And it's also just really nice. The thing that motivates me is hearing from students how it's helped them. I think especially at the moment with the lockdown making it really hard to meet new people, especially for asylum seekers who've recently arrived. They don't know that many people or anyone here. Just to be able to have a connection with someone else in society feels really important, and hearing that is really nice.
That is definitely a great coincidence as well.
Yeah.
Now I would like you to say what these words mean to you. There are a few words here. And
Okay.
first, what does homeland mean to you?
I think it is partly the place where you're born, because I think the place where you're born shapes your values and your identity. But I also think you can find a home in a place that you weren't born. So I think it's also to do with feeling a sense of belonging, a sense of community. So I moved to London nearly 2 years ago. And obviously there's so many people, it's a really big place, but just feeling like a tiny part of a massive network I think that's pretty cool. I think that can be part of a feeling of home as well.
Definitely. And next one is, how would you describe the word refugee?
I think a refugee is anyone who's been forced to leave their country for any reason, whether it's political, religious, conflict due to their sexuality, climate change. I think it's pretty hard to generalize because everyone has very different experiences.
Definitely. Obviously, quarantine is a very, very difficult time for all of us, but especially for refugees, it's very difficult. It's a troubling time. But how can we, as people of the community, help these refugees during such troubling time?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think being isolated is really hard for everyone, but being isolated in possibly a new country or a country where you don't know that many people must feel even harder. And I think part of it is on a basic level, just showing that we care, that refugees are welcome. So trying to form connections where possible. I hope that volunteering for RefuNet is a way to help just one person by giving that English lesson or whatever subject it is. It's hopefully improving their English skills as well, but also just being another person that they get to interact with and hopefully feel a little bit less isolated. I think the other thing is it's been really sad to see that obviously so many people are struggling, worrying about friends and family, but also struggling financially. And it feels a little bit like the most vulnerable people have been left behind a little bit. So recently the universal credit benefit was increased, but the same hasn't happened for the asylum seeker allowance. So asylum seekers only get £37 a week to live on, and particularly at the start when prices of really basic things were going up, is really challenging. So there's been campaigns for that to be increased, and things like the ban on asylum seekers working. The rules about asylum seekers working in the UK are stricter than in most other European countries, and it just seems crazy when there are skilled, doctors, nurses, lots of other professions, and also even people that aren't skilled doctors and nurses but would like to be able to help in some way, whether that's working in a supermarket or whatever it is. And then things like reading about evictions in the sort of unofficial refugee camps in Calais, forcing people to leave when people aren't allowed to be moving. There's no way that they can go to. It just seems crazy, really. And I think sometimes these issues can feel so big that there's nothing that we can really do about it, and there's not that much point trying. But I don't think that's true. I think if we come together, if enough people say they care about these issues, then the government does care. I think we saw that a couple of weeks ago when the bereavement scheme for doctors and nurses, migrant doctors and nurses who are working in the NHS, it means that if they pass away, then their families are allowed to stay in the UK. But originally, that didn't apply to cleaners and porters' families. But after public pressure, it's now been extended. And there was also public pressure that meant that migrants who work in the NHS no longer have to pay the extra charge for the NHS. So I think it is really exciting to see what can be done. I was just reading this morning about how the government is thinking about not extending the family reunion programme that allows people to reunite with their families in the UK. So I think the best way to get change is to make the system fairer, and to do that we need enough people telling the government that we want a fairer system.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. So, Bethany, through RefuNet, I'm sure you've met many refugees.
Mm-hmm.
But what is a problem we've witnessed repeatedly on many occurrences with many refugees?
Well, I think I have to say education, because that's what I talk to people mostly about with RefuNet. Not being able to speak English is such a barrier, and without the right support, it can take so long to learn. Even if you're living in the country, if you don't have a job that requires you to use English, or if you're not part of a group of people that speak English, it can really take a long time. And I met lots of people who are really dedicated to learning, but it's a really difficult context to work in, particularly if they have mental health problems that makes it hard to study, and things like that. So I think whatever support can be provided to help people learn English as quickly as possible, then the easier it is to integrate and sort of start a new life.
Definitely. So when the word refugee is said, there are a lot of negative connotations in people's heads, but in what ways do you think refugees can benefit the country as well?
I think lots of ways. I think partly we forget that refugees had a life in the place that they came from, and they might be doctors, teachers, accountants, or whatever. They have lots of skills that they can contribute from their previous life. But also, I think people that have been through really difficult circumstances and managed to get to the UK and are working really hard to rebuild their lives are probably pretty resilient, pretty resourceful people that are a massive contribution. But I think it's really easy to talk. People argue that you can't have too many people because the NHS can't afford it and things like that. And so it's really important to recognise that refugees do contribute to the economy, to society. But also I think it's more than that. I think we're so lucky that we get to meet people from so many different places. I think it makes the UK a more interesting place to live, that it's so much more diverse, and being able to meet people with different cultures, different values, different ways of life. I think everyone can benefit and learn from interacting with people from different backgrounds. So for me, that's the best thing, the chance to meet people from different places and to learn from them.
Great. And finally, what advice would you give to a newly arrived refugee?
So I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this question, because I've never been a refugee, but I will try. I think one thing is to not, if you know how to, if you know who to ask, to not be afraid to ask for help. I've had people say to me, "Oh, I'm really sorry to ask you this. but can you find a new teacher for me? Or don't put yourself out in any way. And I think it must be really hard to feel like you're asking for help all the time, but there are so many people who are happy to help. And I think it's also really, really important to recognise that I think teachers get as much from it as students do when they're teaching. As I said, they get to meet a new person from a different background, but also teaching is something that's really rewarding. And it doesn't just apply to teaching as well. I think, in some ways it can be a hostile environment, but there are also lots of people who really do want to help. So trying to remember that and reaching out to those people. And then I guess it must feel really hard arriving in a place where you don't know that many people. At the start, it must be the hardest when you don't know anyone, you haven't worked out, the culture is new, there are so many things to learn. I think trying to sort of remember that it can get better as you start to integrate. And I think the last thing is just welcome.
Yeah, right. Is there anything else you would like to add for our viewers, Bethany?
No, I think that's everything. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. I hope it was interesting.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sparing your valuable time and sharing with us your amazing experience. We can't wait to catch up with you again. And also thanks to our viewers as well. We hope you have enjoyed listening to Bethany's inspirational story, and we're hoping to see you again in our next talk. Goodbye.
Thanks to Bethany Holden for this motivational and inspiring talk. Now we have another art performance from our volunteers. Enjoy! Thank you all for being with us today. A special thanks to Sara Nathan and Bethany Holden for their lovely talks, and thanks to our friends for showing us the power of art. Don't forget to follow us on our Instagram, Twitter and YouTube accounts. We're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at the same time. Goodbye!